The Sunday perimeter walk was a ritual of silence and observation. Ember kept pace with Papa Finn, her movements measured, matching the steady cadence of his stride. They moved through the undergrowth without snapping a single twig or disturbing the low-hanging ferns. The forest floor was a map of damp soil and decaying leaves, and they read it with every step. Ember watched the way Papa Finn tilted his head, his senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the air. He did not speak, and she did not ask for words. They reached the creek, where the water moved sluggishly over smooth, dark stones. The air here was colder, carrying the scent of wet silt and pine needles. Ember stopped, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, saturated earth. She watched the water swirl around a submerged branch, waiting for the familiar pulse of the woods to settle. Papa Finn stood beside her, his gaze sweeping the tree line. The canopy above filtered the light into thin, shifting ribbons of gray. It was a quiet morning, the kind that usually held no surprises. They stood in the stillness for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic drip of water from a mossy overhang. Everything was exactly as it had been for years. The forest was breathing, and they were part of its breath. Ember shifted her weight, her eyes catching a sharp irregularity in the mud near the bank. It was not a natural erosion pattern. She stepped closer, her breath hitching as the shape resolved into a single, massive depression. She pointed, her finger trembling slightly as she traced the outline of a footprint. It was broad, heavy, and sunk deep into the saturated earth, as if something of immense weight had pressed down with deliberate force. 5 distinct toe pads were visible, each one larger than her palm. Ember knelt, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked closer. Deep, jagged gouges scarred the mud where the creature had pushed off. The claw marks were long and carved into the soil with enough pressure to displace heavy rocks. She looked up at Papa Finn, her throat tight. He moved to her side, his posture shifting from relaxed to rigid in an instant. He did not look at her. He dropped to his knees, his focus locked on the indentation. He reached out, hovering his hand inches above the gouges. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now felt heavy and suffocating. Ember stood, her legs stiff from the damp ground. She turned her attention away from the mud to the wider perimeter of their home. The fear of the footprint was now joined by a growing, colder puzzle. She began to speak, her voice low and steady. She listed the losses, one by one. The berry patches were stripped clean, yet the bushes remained upright. Not a single twig snapped or leaf crushed. The dried fish, stored in the high-reaching hollows of the trees, had vanished entirely. There were no claw marks on the bark, no signs of a struggle, and no remnants of the woven containers left behind. It was as if the items had simply ceased to exist. She paced the small clearing, gesturing to the empty spots where their winter stores had sat only days before. The precision was what unsettled her most. A predator would leave a trail of broken branches or scattered debris, but this thief moved with a ghost's efficiency. She stopped, looking at the dense canopy above, searching for any sign of disturbance. The forest remained still, offering no answers. Papa Finn listened, his gaze fixed on the thicket. Papa Finn remained motionless, his head tilted slightly to catch the shifting currents of the wind. He did not look at Ember. Instead, he inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he sifted through the complex layers of the forest air. A subtle, sharp note cut through the scent of pine and damp earth. He frowned, his eyes narrowing as he identified the smell. It was clean, mineral, and cold. He exhaled slowly, his breath hitching in the quiet. "River stones," he murmured. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the dense thicket that bordered their clearing. He took a step forward, his hand brushing against a low-hanging branch without breaking it. "I smelled it 2 nights ago," he admitted. "I woke up in the dark, caught the scent, and convinced myself it was a dream. A trick of the mind." He looked back at Ember, his expression devoid of comfort, offering only the harsh truth. The threat was now a fact. Papa Finn gestured toward a flat, moss-covered stone near the edge of the clearing. He waited for Ember to settle, his movements deliberate and slow. The forest around them seemed to lean in, the rustling leaves quieting as if the trees themselves were listening. He stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the dense, impenetrable thicket that lay beyond their perimeter. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, stripped of any hesitation. "There is a story," he began, the words carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the air. "It is a tale passed down through the generations, kept alive in the quiet moments of the deep woods." He paused, his gaze tracking a shadow moving across the forest floor. The wandering shadow. It does not walk the earth during times of plenty or peace. He turned his head, looking directly at Ember. It appears only when the deep forest suffers. It comes when the great storms fell the ancient trees, or when the winters turn so cruel that the earth itself seems to harden against life. He let the words hang in the space between them, the gravity of the legend taking hold. The threat was no longer just a footprint, it was a cycle. Ember watched his face, waiting for the inevitable warning about claws or teeth. "Is it a predator?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Papa Finn shook his head slowly, the movement firm and final. He reached down, tracing a line in the dirt with his finger, mimicking a path that led nowhere. "It moves like a threat, but it is merely loneliness," he said. The tension in the air shifted. The image of a monster hunting for blood dissolved, replaced by something far more hollow. It is a creature separated from its kin, searching for what it has lost. He looked up, his eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the canopy. It does not kill because it is hungry for flesh. It kills the silence of the forest because it cannot bear its own isolation. He stood straighter, his posture losing its defensive rigidity. Think of it not as a hunter, but as a ghost of the woods, wandering through the wreckage of storms and the bite of winter. The realization settled over Ember. The creature was not a force of malice, but a victim of its own existence, forever pacing the perimeter of a world that had moved on without it. The fear in her chest began to thin, replaced by a heavy, aching sense of pity. Papa Finn stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the mossy stone. "My father taught me that the only way to meet a shadow is to understand it, not to fight it," he said. His voice was steady, lacking any trace of doubt. Ember looked down at her hands, then back at the dark thicket. The logic felt impossible. How could one understand a force that left such heavy, destructive prints? She watched his eyes, searching for a sign of hesitation, but found only resolve. "To fight it is to defeat the cycle," he continued, his hands gesturing toward the forest as if inviting the creature in. "It senses the aggression. It mirrors the hostility it finds." He reached out, resting a firm hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We must stop looking for a way to strike back. We must look for a way to reach out." Ember felt the tension in her own frame begin to loosen. The idea of empathy as a survival strategy was foreign, yet it resonated with the quiet, hollow sadness she had sensed in the creature's path. She nodded, the initial impulse to defend their home giving way to a new, sharper curiosity. She was no longer just a guardian, she was a witness. That evening, the family gathered around the fire, the orange glow pushing back the encroaching dark. Papa Finn sat on the central log, his hands resting on his knees as he recounted the encounter at the creek. The crackle of burning pine was the only sound in the den. Mama Flora set down her bowl, the ceramic clinking sharply against the stone floor. She stared into the flames, her jaw set tight. Beside her, Ash began shifting his pile of river pebbles. He slid them into precise concentric circles, his fingers trembling just enough to make the stones rattle against each other. Bree leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her gaze fixed on Papa Finn. The warmth of the fire stood in stark contrast to the cold news. The air in the den grew heavy, thick with the weight of the unknown. No one spoke. The flickering light cast long, dancing shapes against the walls. Outside, the forest shifted, the wind carrying a faint, cool scent of river stones that drifted through the entrance. Mama Flora did not look at the fire. She looked at the entrance, then back at the food stores stacked in the corner, her brow furrowed, a deep line appearing between her eyes as she began to move her hands, counting the remaining dried fish. She stood up and walked the perimeter of the den, checking the strength of the woven walls and the thickness of the mud seals. She stopped near the entrance, her gaze sweeping across the dark opening. She did not speak, but her silence was a calculation. She tapped her fingers against the stone ledge, assessing the distance between their home and the creek. Her jaw tightened as she factored in the dwindling winter supplies. Every action was a weight, a tally of what they could afford to lose. She turned toward Papa Finn, her eyes steady, her posture rigid. She pointed to the empty space where the last of the fish had been, then held up 3 fingers, marking the days they had left. The risk was no longer a theory. It was a physical deficit. Ash remained hunched over the patch of dirt near the hearth. He ignored the tension between his parents, focusing entirely on the small, smooth river pebbles he had gathered. He placed one in the center, then arranged the others in a perfect, concentric circle around it. His fingers were stiff, the tips white from the pressure. He slid a pebble into place, but his hand spasmed, knocking the outer ring out of alignment. He froze, his breath hitching in his chest. He reached out to fix it, but his hand trembled so violently that he scattered the stones across the floor. The sound of the pebbles clicking against the stone echoed in the quiet den. He scrambled to gather them, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He lined them up again, his knuckles pale, his eyes darting toward the dark entrance every few seconds. He pushed a stone into the dirt, then another, trying to force the chaos into a rigid, predictable shape. His breathing grew shallow, matching the rapid, frantic pace of his hands. He only watched the circle, his body coiled tight. Bree shifted, her weight moving from her heels to the balls of her feet as she leaned toward the center of the circle. She did not look at the scattered pebbles or the dark entrance. Instead, she watched the fire, her eyes tracking the way the flames licked at the wood. She waited for a lull in the crackling, then spoke. Her voice was thin but carried across the den without wavering. "It takes our food but leaves us be," she said. She held up a hand, fingers splayed, counting off the points. "If it were a hunter, we would be gone by now. It has had every chance to strike, yet it chooses the stores, not us." She paused, her gaze shifting to Papa Finn, then to Mama Flora. The logic hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. It cut through the frantic energy of the room like a blade. She leaned further forward, her posture rigid, her chin lifted. "A hunter kills to eat. A hunter does not wait." She sat back, her hands resting flat on her knees, waiting for the weight of her words to settle into the silence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the walls of the den like a physical weight. No one moved. Mama Flora kept her gaze fixed on the dying embers, her fingers tracing the rim of her bowl until the ceramic clicked. Papa Finn remained still, his notched ear tilted toward the entrance, though he did not turn his head. The fire crackled, a sudden sharp pop of sap that sent a spray of sparks upward. The light surged, then dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the stone walls. These shadows stretched and contracted, mimicking the rhythm of a breathing beast. Ash stopped his frantic movements, his hands resting motionless on the dirt floor. He watched the shadows, his eyes wide and unblinking. Bree held her breath, her posture frozen, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile logic she had just laid out. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow thrum of the fire, marking the seconds as the family sat trapped in the suffocating quiet. The stillness was broken by a shift in the air. It did not come from the back of the den, but from the dark, open tunnel that led to the woods. A draft, thin and biting, snaked its way past the fire. It brought with it a scent that did not belong to the dry earth or the charred wood. It smelled of wet slate, deep water, and the cold mineral tang of river stones. The flames in the center of the room leaned sharply toward the entrance, their light guttering as if trying to follow the current of air. Papa Finn stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not look at the others. His nose twitched, catching the scent again. Mama Flora reached out, her hand closing around a handful of dirt, her knuckles white. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping. Outside, the forest did not rustle. It held its breath. The scent intensified, filling the den, thick and undeniable. It was right there, just beyond the threshold, watching the flicker of their fire from the blackness of the trees. Ember watched the firelight dance on the stone walls, but the terror that had held her captive since finding the prince began to fray at the edges. She looked at her family. Mama Flora was rigid, her gaze locked on the dark tunnel. Ash had pulled his knees to his chest, his breathing shallow and quick. The scent of river stones remained, sharp and persistent, but it no longer felt like a threat to be feared. It felt like a question. Ember pushed herself up from the floor. The movement was small, but it drew every eye in the den. She did not look back. She walked toward the entrance, her boots making no sound on the packed earth. She felt the temperature drop as she neared the opening, the cold air biting at her skin, but she did not flinch. She reached the threshold and leaned forward, bracing her hands against the rough stone of the tunnel wall. She peered into the absolute blackness of the woods. The trees were silhouettes against the faint starlight. She strained her ears, listening past the wind, past the crackle of the fire behind her. The forest was waiting. Her heart rate slowed, steadying into a rhythm of intense, focused observation. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp need to see what was hidden in the dark. Ember stared into the void until the shapes of the trees began to resolve. She traced the path the creature had taken in her mind, recalling the prints she had found near the creek. They were deep, yes, but they were not the tracks of a predator stalking prey. There were no sudden lunges, no signs of a chase, no disturbed brush that suggested a kill. The creature moved in long, wandering lines that circled back on themselves. It was a pattern of aimless, persistent searching. She shifted her weight, the rough stone biting into her palms. If it wanted them, it would have struck when the den was unguarded. Instead, it only took the stores, leaving the family untouched. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The shadow was not hunting for flesh, it was hunting for something it had lost. And it was trapped in a loop of its own making. Every moment they spent hiding, they were ignoring a creature in distress. Ember turned away from the threshold, her movements deliberate and heavy with purpose. She walked back into the center of the den, the firelight catching the intensity in her eyes. The family sat in a tight cluster, their faces etched with the lingering weight of the unknown. She stopped before them, her hands clenched at her sides. "We leave a basket," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "At the edge of the clearing. If it is just hungry, we will know by morning." A ripple of movement passed through the group. Ember did not wait for their agreement. She stepped toward the storage pile, her boots crunching on the dry earth. She picked up a woven basket, the reeds stiff and cool against her palms. She looked at them, daring them to see the logic in her gamble. She held the basket out, the empty space inside waiting to be filled, and waited for the first one to stand. The basket sat between them, a hollow vessel waiting for a purpose. Mama Flora stood, her gaze lingering on the dark, yawning mouth of the den before shifting to Papa Finn. She did not speak, but the tension in her shoulders asked the question that haunted them all. Papa Finn remained still, his notched ear twitching as he listened to the wind outside. He looked at Ember, then at the woven reeds of the basket, and finally back to his mate. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the creature they were debating. Then, slowly, Papa Finn tilted his head. He nodded, once a heavy movement that settled the debate. Mama Flora exhaled, the sound sharp. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rim of the basket. The transition from decision to action was immediate. Mama Flora moved to the back of the den, her hands searching the shadows of the storage alcove. She pulled out the remaining stores, the sound of dried fish hitting the floor echoing against the stone walls. They worked in a rhythm born of necessity. Ember knelt by the pile, sorting through the berries, discarding the bruised ones, selecting only the firmest, brightest fruit. Each movement was precise, deliberate. They were not just packing food, they were curating a message. Papa Finn joined them, his large hands carefully layering the salted fish at the base of the basket. He handled the dried strips as if they were fragile glass, his focus absolute. Bree brought the last of the dried herbs, tucking them into the corners, to mask the scent of human habitation, hoping to make the offering seem natural to the woods. The air was thick with the smell of salt and earth. When the final berry was placed, the family stood back. The basket sat on the cold floor, a small woven island of order in the center of their home. Papa Finn lifted the basket, his grip firm. He signaled for the others to stay back. Ember followed him, her steps silent against the packed dirt of the tunnel. As they neared the entrance, the warmth of the den faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic bite of the night wind. The forest outside was a wall of absolute black, breathing with a rhythmic, low rustle. Papa Finn paused at the threshold, his head tilted, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. He took the first step into the clearing, his body tense, every muscle coiled for a retreat. Ember stayed close, her eyes locked on the mossy stone 10 paces ahead. The ground felt exposed. Papa Finn lowered the basket, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. He set it down. Ember did not return to the fire. She moved to the edge of the den entrance, pressing her shoulder against the rough stone wall. The air here was thin and frigid, carrying the scent of damp pine and decaying leaves. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to minimize her presence, yet her eyes remained fixed on the clearing. The moon hung high, casting long, distorted shapes across the mossy stone. Where the basket sat, every flicker of a leaf in the wind looked like a movement. Every rustle of dry grass sounded like a footfall. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting the seconds to keep her mind from racing. Her muscles were tight, coiled like a spring, ready to bolt if the darkness shifted. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The forest remained unnervingly still, a vast, silent void that seemed to be watching her back. She felt the weight of her family behind her, their low, rhythmic breathing, a stark contrast to the heavy silence outside. She shifted her weight, the stone biting into her skin. But she did not look away. She was the anchor now. She would not blink, she would not flinch. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even the sound of her own pulse. Ember stared at the clearing, her eyes watering from the strain of keeping them wide. The moon drifted behind a cloud, plunging the woods into a deeper, impenetrable shade. Then, the stillness broke. A dry branch snapped, the sound cracking through the night like a whip. It was sharp, sudden, and terrifyingly close to the basket. Ember flinched, her hands gripping the stone wall until her knuckles turned white. She held her breath, every nerve ending screaming for her to retreat, but she remained frozen. From the dense underbrush, a shape began to detach itself from the darkness. It did not move like a predator stalking prey. It moved with a strange, fluid grace. A massive, dark form stepped into the clearing, its outline blurring against the trees. It was heavy, solid, and undeniably real. It paused, the air around it shifting as it tested the wind. The creature stood tall, a towering silhouette that dwarfed the stone where the basket sat. Ember watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the entity turned its head toward the den. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The creature did not rush. It drifted forward, each step silent, despite the mass that bent the saplings in its path. Ember felt the air grow heavy, a sudden drop in temperature that prickled her skin. The creature was gargantuan, a mountain of shadow that seemed to pull the remaining starlight into itself. It reached the flat, moss-covered stone and stopped. The basket now looked like a mere pebble at the feet of a titan. The creature lowered its head, the movement slow and deliberate. It hovered inches above the woven rim, its nostrils flaring as it inhaled. The sound was like a deep, rhythmic intake of wind, pulling the scent of the berries and dried fish into the darkness of its lungs. It stood perfectly still, a statue carved from the night, its bulk casting a long, distorted shadow that reached all the way to the den entrance. Ember watched the way the creature's muscles rippled under its dark hide, a constant, shifting tension. It remained locked on the basket. The creature remained a pillar of silence, its massive frame barely stirring in the night air. It shifted its weight, the ground beneath its feet groaning under the sudden redistribution of mass. A heavy paw, thick with coarse texture and tipped with curved obsidian-like talons, extended toward the woven rim of the basket. Ember watched, her muscles locked. As the limb stopped mid-air, the claws did not touch the reeds. They hovered, trembling slightly, as if the creature were sensing the vibration of the woven fibers. It was not a simple act of scavenging. The creature tilted its head, the movement jagged and mechanical as it processed the arrangement of the berries and the salted fish. The air grew dense, charged with a static pressure that made the fine hairs on Ember's arms stand upright. It held its paw suspended, a mountain of potential force, held in check by a singular, focused curiosity. The creature withdrew its paw, the talons retracting into the thick, dark hide. It did not reach for the food. Instead, the massive head began a slow, grinding rotation, the neck muscles bunching and releasing with the sound of dry timber snapping. It turned away from the basket, its focus shifting across the clearing. Ember held her breath, her back pressed hard against the rough wall. The creature stopped. It was looking directly at the entrance. Two eyes, vast and luminous, caught the sliver of starlight. They were not predatory. They were deep, ancient, and hollow. The light reflected off the surface of those eyes, creating a shimmering silver distortion. She tried to blink, to look down, but the weight of that gaze held her in place. It was a physical tether, anchoring her to the threshold. She saw the reflection of the den's interior in those eyes, a tiny, distorted image of her own face staring back at her. The world narrowed down to that single point of contact, a silent exchange where the fear finally evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp recognition. The creature broke the gaze, its head dipping toward the woven basket. The movement was fluid, lacking the jagged tension of its earlier approach. It reached out again, but this time, the massive limb moved with surgical precision. The talons did not scrape the stone or tear the reeds. Instead, the creature extended a single digit, its tip dark and calloused. It hovered over the pile of salted fish and berries, hovering for a heartbeat before settling on a single dark fruit. The creature pinched the berry between its claw and the pad of its digit. It lifted the item slowly, the rest of the basket remaining undisturbed. There was no greed in the action, no frantic snatching of the stores. The creature held the berry up, turning it slightly in the starlight as if inspecting the quality of the offering. It did not consume the fruit immediately. It held the berry against its snout, a gesture that looked less like feeding and more like a ritual of acceptance. The forest air seemed to settle. Ember watched, her hands finally relaxing their grip on the doorframe as the creature signaled the end of the long, silent standoff. The creature lowered its head, the berry still held delicately between its claw and pad. It did not linger. With a subtle shift of its weight, the massive form pivoted, its heavy paws making no sound against the damp earth. It turned its back to the den, the thick hide rippling as it moved toward the dense wall of the forest. Ember watched the silhouette shrink, the dark bulk blending into the shifting patterns of the trees. It reached the edge of the clearing, where the starlight failed to penetrate the thicket. For a brief second, it stopped. The creature tilted its head, a final, rhythmic twitch of its ears, before stepping into the void. The basket remained on the flat stone, the pile of berries and fish largely untouched, a small woven island in the clearing. The shadow had gone, returning to the depths, leaving the perimeter undisturbed and the offering behind as a mark of the night's strange, silent truce. Ember let out a long, shuddering breath. Her lungs, which had been tight for hours, finally expanded fully. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that slowly began to steady itself. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the doorframe, feeling the grain beneath her skin, anchoring herself to the reality of the den. The adrenaline that had kept her muscles coiled and ready to run now drained away, leaving her limbs feeling heavy and loose. She leaned her forehead against the frame, closing her eyes for a second to listen. The forest was truly quiet. She opened her eyes and looked back at the stone. The basket sat there, a small, woven monument to the night's decision. They had chosen to offer, to acknowledge, and to wait. The tension that had defined their lives was gone. She looked at her family, seeing them not as survivors hiding from a threat, but as participants in a new, unspoken pact. Ember walked back into the center of the den. The fire had burned down to a steady, glowing bed of coals, casting a warm, stable light across the floor. Papa Finn looked up, his notched ear still, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet, knowing intensity. He did not ask what she had seen. He simply nodded, a slow movement that acknowledged the change in the air. Mama Flora reached out, her hand brushing Ember's arm as she stood to stir the embers. There was no frantic movement, no checking of the perimeter, no sharpening of tools. The atmosphere had shifted from a state of siege to one of rest. Bree and Ash were already settling into their sleeping spots, the tension that had kept them upright and alert for days finally dissolving. Ember sat down, feeling the solid, cool earth beneath her. She looked at the entrance, now just an opening to the night, rather than a gateway for a threat. The forest outside was the same, yet the relationship had changed. They were no longer hiding from the unknown. They were sharing the woods with it. The wind shifted again, bringing the scent of pine and damp earth, but it no longer carried the sharp, cold edge of fear. It was just the smell of home. Ember watched the firelight dance on the walls, her eyes heavy. For the first time, that was not a danger. It was a balance.